So the next president on the list is the 18th president of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. So again, the five criteria we look at to have as a rubric just to kind of guide our conversation are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and the most important of all, do they leave the country better or worse than they found it? I'm going to start with growth, but Grant is a very difficult president to look at for many reasons, which I'll get into. And a lot of his presidency I kind of view as what ifs. He had not inherited what he inherited. What if the global situation had not been what it is? I find Grant to be someone who, with some exceptions, but for the most part, particularly when you compare him to his time, which, again, part of the reason we're doing this entire video is to look at them in the context of their time, compare them to who came before and after, so we can discuss them in context. For his time, Grant tried to do a lot of the right things. And so in discussing his presidency, I had a lot of trouble deciding in my own mind how many things that failed because he didn't do it properly, and how many things failed because they were simply impossible, at least for him. And it left me kind of we've been doing this roller coaster where we go from Buchanan, who probably is going to be the worst president. I'm not sure if anyone's going to be worse. We'll see when we get there. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm trying to look at each one of these as I come to them, even though I've studied history before. I'm still trying to approach each one as fresh as I can. So you go from Buchanan to Lincoln, who did things, as you're looking back on the history, it's amazing what he accomplished during his presidency. While a war was going on, he was also able to expand the country, set up infrastructure that would come and rebuild the economy after he died, and in just 5 years. And then to Andrew Johnson, who just completely collapsed any hope for Reconstruction. So Grant comes in and he tries to do things that I think should contribute to the future growth of America, and arguably did. The 15th Amendment, giving blacks voting rights in a constitutional way, to get that passed, huge. He did pass a number of laws and push a number of laws. He created the Department of Justice almost entirely to fight the Klan, but it was too late. When you give a terrorist group 3 or 4 years to build up when they already are a paramilitary group coming out of war. So again, think of the South this way. You have the Confederacy, who were defeated on the battlefield, but only by complete mobilization and focus on war. They're all sent home with their guns. They still exist. They still have the same mission. They were just defeated. That paramilitary group is allowed to return to power and oppress a minority that had no access to wealth, guns, power prior. And the federal government, for the entire Johnson administration, just looked the other way. Whatever laws were passed, they weren't actively doing anything to enforce them. And so by the time Grant comes in, could he have done more? Probably. Was there political will to do more? I don't know. So I can't put upon Grant the failures that came from Jim Crow later. We'll have a long discussion about that with the corrupt bargain of Rutherford Hayes. But I want to give Grant credit for making the effort. He did create the Department of Justice. He did try to prosecute the Klan. And then eventually his own courts basically said they were not going to enforce any of the laws that were passed. Some of that does fall on Grant because some of the appointments were Grant appointments, but some of them were also Lincoln appointments. Another reason Lincoln is second and not first. So in terms of growth, I would say that he's positive in his intentions, but what were the outcomes? That's part of the question. He did bring a lot of the South back in. A lot of the southern states were allowed to reintegrate. The laws were there. He created the national park system, Yellowstone becoming the first park under his watch. He tried to do additional things, like he tried to annex Santo Domingo. He was secretly allowing aid to the Cuban uprising. But I think I'll discuss that more in international politics. But in terms of growth, I'm not going to give him a negative, and I'm not going to give him a positive. I think he did what he thought he could to try to bring the South through Reconstruction, to try to create the opportunity for Reconstruction to take hold. That it didn't take hold I cannot lay completely on him. And I don't know if anyone could have, given what was left to him. So I can't give him high ranks, but I have to respect his effort. In terms of finances, there's this first term and a second term, but again, the major thing people will point to for Grant as far as his failures would be the Panic of 1873, which the United States did so much better than Europe. Where the Great Depression, what they had called the Great Depression at that point until the actual Great Depression came later, there was a huge depression. Uh, there was a huge economic collapse in Europe that lasted for decades in Europe. In America, it lasted for about 3 years, give or take. There's some argument and debate. But starting in 1873, there was a financial panic. Again, where it originated and the focus of power in Europe, far worse. I don't think that Grant could do anything to stop it. And the fact that the United States had seemingly less effects than other countries should be to his credit, but it still occurred on his watch. Could he have done anything about it? That's a historical debate, similar to the Reconstruction debate. I think Grant did what he thought was right. I think historically, I'm looking back going, I think he made a lot of the right decisions. There were a lot of things that he did with regards to reducing debt before that put them in a position where they were able to be ready. And perhaps that's why they didn't collapse as much as 1873. But you can't say that the financial situation was good when you have a major recession on your watch. So something to think about. International politics. I will rate him fairly highly here because many historians argue he created the concept of international arbitration using the Treaty of Washington. This idea of negotiations and third-party arbitration was something that really didn't exist. It was mostly we fought wars to make these kind of decisions. And the modernization of diplomacy and having international arbitrators was huge and new, and I think is a very much a positive thing that happened during Grant's administration. He didn't engage in many international wars and conflicts. There was, again, as I mentioned, he tried to annex Santo Domingo but didn't. He probably was conspiring with Cubans to overthrow the Spanish, but he didn't entrench the United States into any major international wars, and there were many opportunities for that to happen. He avoided it. In terms of war and security, this is a tough one because, again, is it his fault that he inherited a terrorist state? And by state, I mean not like an individual state. I mean the state of the South being full of the Ku Klux Klan terrorist forces. Was it his fault that the Colfax Massacre led the Supreme Court to functionally tie the hands of the federal government to even enforce basic law against state wishes? If the state was able to rig the elections to elect white supremacists who then passed Jim Crow laws, and the federal government and the Supreme Court ordered that there should be no interaction. There's some fault because he picked some of the justices who wrote that law, but that was the will of the country at the time. They were tired of trying to help others, particularly when the recession came in 1873. Empathy goes away when economics are in peril. The Native American issues at the time. Custer's Last Stand occurs during Grant's time. But relative to what came before, he was probably more moderate. He appointed the first Native American to run, or the first Native American in the Indian Affairs Department. He was empathetic to the ideals for his time. For now, if you look at him now, obviously all of this is horribly racist and he didn't do nearly enough. If you look at him in our context, looking back, going, wish we'd done more. But for his time, it's remarkable. But it didn't work. It wasn't successful. Do I give him credit for trying? I think I kind of do, even if it didn't work. Similarly, some of the earliest women's rights acts passed, women earning property rights. That was something that was completely new. Doesn't really fall under war and security, but that's again, the rubric is loose because we're having these discussions. But the country was also unstable during this time. There was unrest in the South. There was unrest in Native American territories. That happened on his watch. You can't forget that happened on his watch. And that brings us to the final item, better or worse. Passing the 15th Amendment, to his credit. Attempting to have some more normalcy with women's rights, attempting to restrain the military somewhat. Again, he condemned a lot of the Native American massacres, but he couldn't control them. The Colfax massacre, with the Supreme Court tying the hands, making the Civil Rights Act of 1875 functionally moot because even if it was passed by Congress, the federal courts basically said there was no constitutional ability for the federal government to enforce it. How much do you blame Grant for what other people in the states and in the courts refused to do? At the same time, I don't think you can give him a huge amount of credit because it didn't happen. But imagine any of the other presidents we have in the same situation. Do they even make the effort? Do they even slow the slide into the chaos of Jim Crow? Do they give in to the impulses to commit more bloody massacres with regards to Native Americans, to repress women's rights? The public school system arguably is beginning to grow during this time around black leaders trying to get mass education. That's a foundation that Grant helped to build. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us looking at a president who I think, for the most part, had instincts ahead of his time, whose inclinations were positive, and his actions were overall positive, but he didn't do enough, and perhaps he couldn't do enough to get the country to not slide into what would happen in the next presidency with the corrupt bargain, to what would happen with the ever collapsing of the Native American rights. Perhaps no one could have done it, but at least he tried. So, looking at it that way, where do I put him on the list? He's not going to be in the top 5. Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, Polk, and Monroe, I think, all left the country clearly better than they found it. There's quibbles about in Monroe and Polk on specific things, but I think they're above Grant. I think he's definitely above the Adams, Quincy, and John, because I can't comfortably say with 100% certainty that either left the country better or worse, better than they found it. And I think I can argue Grant left it better than Andrew Johnson gave it to him. So do I put him above James Madison? I think I do. So I'm going to put him at number 6. And I really think the only reason I'm doing it is because James Madison, I think, had a better second term. But on James Madison's first term, the British burned the Capitol to the ground, and that never happened on Grant's watch. So I'm going to put Ulysses S. Grant right now at number 6.